Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you again for joining us on this latest edition of ASMIA's webinar Conversations. I am Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of the Association of Middle East Studies in Africa, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon. This afternoon, we have the great pleasure of once again having our friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, to talk to us about his recent project, which is obviously quite timely and critical. His latest book, which is getting a lot of press, is the only book on the war in Gaza that took place this past May, entitled Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War, where he details really the challenges and really the differences of Israel's, I think, history of its wars in Gaza over the past few years, which we'll be discussing with us this afternoon. Schanzer has been intimately involved in a lot of the debates going on within Palestinian politics, and this latest book is a phenomenal addition to his writing and scholarship on the topic. The book was produced by his own think tank, FDD, and their newly launched press, if I'm correct about that. Correct me if I'm wrong, John. And there's a lot to be said on the topic. I will not take away from John talking, but as far as some housekeeping issues before we get to John, he will talk for about 25 minutes. Then we will open up the floor to as many questions as we have time for. Please type in your questions via the chat. If we don't get to your questions this afternoon, I apologize in advance. You could always email us after the webinar, and we will do our best to respond in a timely fashion. So without further ado, John, thanks again for joining us, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you for the virtual floor, Asaf, and thanks for having me back. I know I was recently with you guys back in September, I guess it was, the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, looking at how academia has fared over the years. First, I just want to say congrats on your recent conference in Washington, D.C., and I guess it was also virtual as well. I heard it was a great success. So yeah, I'll talk about my my new book. I'll hold it up so you can get a closer look at it. It's Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. We did put it out through FDD Press, and the idea for that was that we wanted to do it more quickly, quite frankly. As you all probably know, writing a book, even for trade publication or for academic press, will usually take more than a year. My sense was that after the war that I witnessed and watched very closely for those 11 days in May, my sense was that something needed to be produced more urgently. And the reason for that was really the massive gap in coverage between here in the United States and a lot of the Western publications that I tracked during the war, and what I saw out of Israel. And I watched Israeli TV day and night. I'll just say parenthetically that Apple TV is a remarkable technology. I was able to watch 2 Israeli channels live throughout, as well as Al Arabiya and Palestine TV, and to be able to watch in native language as the war unfolded was truly remarkable. I learned a lot about the various episodes, and I won't probably get into all of them here, but suffice it to say that there was a really significant gap between the kind of coverage that we saw here in the United States and what happened over there. Now, some people will have talked to me as I've started to engage with folks about the book. There's been a lot of talk about bias. Of course, this is, I think, what's alleged often when dealing with coverage of Palestinian-Israeli conflicts. I don't think that bias really covers it here, nor do I think that fake news is a good term to wield here as well. It really was about choices in the way that the conflict was covered. The decisions to cover certain stories or to focus on certain issues was really what struck me. And I got the sense that in general, the American media, American analysts, even some of the academics and professors that cover this, they just chose to cover Palestinian components of this conflict rather than looking at the nature of Hamas, looking at the nature of those that sponsor Hamas, namely Iran, Turkey, Qatar, even to a certain extent Malaysia. That analysis went largely untouched during the war. Instead, it was a focus on Israel's actions primarily, and in most cases, actions that were roundly condemned. That's, of course, not a surprise to anyone who's tracked this conflict in years past, but I must say that it really struck me, especially as I saw the Arabic coverage. Watching Al Arabiya in particular, I noticed something that is very different than in years past, and that is that the coverage was far less blanketed and far less vitriolic. I think it was a reflection of some of the changes that we've seen in the region over the last year, namely the Abraham Accords, the decision on the part of the UAE, as well as Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco, to engage in normalization with the Israelis. And you began to see that the Arabs were just far less interested in excoriating Israel repeatedly and kind of on a loop, as has often been the case in conflicts past. In fact, I saw much more nuance in the Arabic media coverage of this, much more nuance than we saw here in the United States in our press, or again, in the analysis that we saw from think tank analysts or from the academic world. I think also lost in this, and this is, I think, maybe where I'll get into some of the comparative studies and kind of the deep background of the conflict. Lost in all this is how we got here, which is to say that Gaza is a lost jurisdiction. This is the way that it was described to me by an Israeli general who I had the opportunity to meet after I wrote the first draft of the book. I actually wrote the first 120 pages in about 8 days following the war. Then I spent 10 days in Israel just before the Delta variant began to spread. So I had a real opportunity to chat with folks. The guy that I'm talking about here, though, was Eliezer Toledano. This is the general in charge of the Southern Command in Israel. And he was talking about how Gaza is just an unwanted place. The Palestinians lost control of this territory back in 2007. The Israelis left it several years before that. The Egyptians had occupied it from 1948 until 67, and then it was taken from them by Israel in the course of a war. But the Egyptians don't want it any longer. And so what you have right now is a situation where Gaza has been under the control of Hamas. It's been that way since 2007. This is the result of a political struggle that really was initiated at the start of the first Intifada in the late 1980s, but culminated with the decision in 2006, urged on by the George W. Bush administration, to hold elections in both Palestinian territories, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It was an ill-advised move. It was one that I think the Bush administration undoubtedly still regrets to this day, but it tracked with the Bush administration's initiative of trying to promote democracy as an alternative to terrorism and radicalism around the Middle East. The polls seem to indicate that the Fatah faction, the secular or more pragmatic faction of the Palestinian, within the Palestinian political spectrum, that they would win that election and that Hamas would lose. As we all know, that was not the case. Hamas, in fact, won, and Hamas won, and the result was a standoff for about a year, in which the Palestinian Authority, with the backing of the United States and Israel, refused to cede ground, refused to allow Hamas to take over for fear of effectively launching a new war between Israel and the Palestinians. But the end result was that Hamas, seeing no other way to gain control, launched an offensive war in the Gaza Strip, took it over in the course of a few short days, and then remained effectively the sovereign. And 14 years later, that is still the case. And there does not seem to be an easy way to dislodge Hamas. It's only gotten stronger thanks to the support of a number of the patrons that I mentioned earlier, namely Iran primarily. And that support comes in the form of weapons, rockets, ammunition, training, tunnels, you name it. I mean, and we've seen hundreds of millions of dollars in assistance over the years. And by the way, a good book can and should be written on that. And maybe that's another project for me in the future, because it has gone largely ignored. In fact, many analysts during the war itself said that there was no footprint of Iran during this conflict. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Iran has taken a unique approach to Gaza, It sort of builds on that adage of, give a man a fish and, they'll rely on you, teach a man how to fish, and they'll be able to provide for themselves every day. That's what essentially Iran has done. They've taught Hamas how to fish, so to speak. Hamas has the ability now to defend itself, to build its own rockets, to build its own tunnels. And that is what's happened over the years. But as they've built up this capacity, that's where we have really seen Hamas flex its muscles, I guess is probably the best way of putting it. And just to be clear, we've seen now 4 different wars that have taken place in the Gaza Strip over the years. One was in 2009, the next was in 2012. After that was 2014. Then we had the longest gap between these wars. Instead of 2 or 3 years, it was 7. As we now understand it, Hamas was really preparing significantly for that next round, building a labyrinth of tunnels that the Israelis ended up nicknaming the Metro. That was destroyed relatively early on during the conflict with a bit of controversy. We can get to that in Q&A. But what I thought was interesting, and I'll just briefly touch on here, is the pattern that we see. And the pattern is this with each one of these conflicts. The first thing is that Hamas continues to fire rockets on a fairly regular basis at Israel. They don't need a reason to do so. It's often described as, some kind of defensive measure or response to, in this case, is a court case that was winding its way through the Israeli court system. But Hamas does not need an excuse to do this. They fire these rockets with regularity. Thousands of rockets have been fired, maybe tens of thousands of rockets have been fired over the years. Sometimes they go in 1s and 2s, sometimes they go in larger clusters. Israel absorbs most of them. Israel does not actually want a war with the Gaza Strip. The thinking there is that this is a tactical threat. Hezbollah is more of a strategic threat. Iran is more of an existential threat. But the idea of going to war in the Gaza Strip for Israel is just, it runs against every fiber of all of the thinking within the IDF senior command. It's just not worth it. It costs money. It's a strain on the population, and the Israeli public just does not want to endure this for reasons that they don't even understand why these wars break out in the first place. So the Israelis absorb a lot of these attacks. Then typically what happens when we look at escalation is Hamas has made a decision, whether it's the kidnapping of an Israeli soldier or it's rockets aimed at Jerusalem, Israel's capital, or at the sort of slender waistline of Israel on the Mediterranean coast, the most populated area, of course. I'm referring to the Tel Aviv area and its environs. That's usually when Israel feels that it needs to respond in kind. Israel responds, usually with a set of high-value targets that Israel has identified well in advance, and then that's generally what leads to the escalation. Now, when the escalation does happen, and again, I'm giving you kind of how this works almost mathematically. I mean, you can predict, you can see these things happen. And if you've watched 4 of these up close, you can see that they all meet the same basic description. But when the escalation happens, we see increasing numbers of rockets fired early on by Hamas. This most recent round, they were able to fire several hundred rockets in a cluster, as opposed to before this, when there were dozens, and before that, a handful. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Hamas has learned how to stabilize these rockets, that they know how to control the payloads and to ensure that they don't cause what Israelis commonly refer to as work accidents. But when Israel responds, they are against pre-approved targets. These are target banks, as they're known. These are legally approved targets, usually approved well in advance by the Shin Bet, the IDF's legal advisors, as well as Israel's Ministry of Justice. And these are not targets that Israel fires at out of anger. They're not lashing out. They are pre-approved, and it's almost automatic that when the war begins, that's when these targets are hit. And, in this most recent round, it took Israel 7 years to come up with this target bank. Israel fired roughly 3 times more munitions into the Gaza Strip as Hamas fired at them. Of course, the difference was that the rockets that Hamas fired were largely or almost entirely unguided. which means they were just simply hoping to hit something inside Israel proper. Israel's response was to remove them from the battlefield with Iron Dome, which was, again, as it has been in the past, 90-95% effective. And then the other munitions that were deployed were the very precise, or PGMs, precision guided munitions, that hit inside the Gaza Strip, almost entirely military targets. And this is the way this goes. Hamas fires off as many of these rockets as they can. Israel neutralizes as many as they can, while trying to also hit these target banks that have been pre-approved. We begin to see a trailing off of the conflict. We see a flagging of the the cadence, if you will, of these conflicts. They begin to trail off primarily when Israel has depleted the majority of its target banks. Some new targets can present themselves in real time, and Israel can get hastened approval to target them amidst a hot war. But we begin to see the trailing off of these exchanges of fire. By then, that's when the ceasefire efforts, almost always led by Egypt, and certainly embraced by the United States and the Europeans and the UN, that's when the ceasefire efforts begin to speed up. And then the ceasefire is ultimately announced, and that's when the hard work begins. And there, I think, the hard work meaning that there's an attempt to try to maintain the ceasefire. And right now, that is what's happening. You've got the Egyptians, as well as others from the Arab world, the US, the Europeans, the UN, trying to come up with a solution for the isolation of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, while still allowing for the provision of goods to flow in and the provision of funding so that Gaza can be rebuilt. How successful that is, we won't know, but you'll know how successful it is by how long it takes before now and the next war to erupt. But this is the cadence. This is the cycle. If there is a cycle of violence, it is exactly that. There are very clear characteristics of these conflicts. It is remarkable to me how little this is understood in the media coverage and in the understanding of how these wars break out, why they break out, why they end, and just the mountain of coverage, the slew of coverage that we saw during the war, and how it just, people ignore this and instead attribute these conflicts to this very strange notion that, the Arabs, or rather the Palestinians and Israelis are sort of like Tom and Jerry, or Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, that they just simply hate each other, and that's the reason for the conflict, and it just happens every once in a while, and they lash out at one another. It's really not the case. It's never the case, in fact, that these are very calculated decisions on the part of Hamas. In this case, I believe Hamas saw that there was significant political gain to be made by putting themselves front and center as the saviors, or the foremost proponents of the Palestinian cause. Israel does not want these wars, but responds when they feel that they must. Then they go through the cycle that I just mentioned, and then we wait once again. My assessment is, of course, and I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, there will be a fifth round. There will be likely another war. The question is whether Israel needs to engage next time preemptively because of the introduction of new advanced weapons that we've seen now already trickle into the hands of Hezbollah. By this, I'm referring to the precision-guided munitions. We've not seen it yet in the hands of Hamas. If we do see that happen, it could be that Israel preempts, but that is often not the case. That's certainly not what we've seen in the previous 4 rounds. But these things have a very clear pattern to them. I think it's important to understand this, to be able to see these conflicts for what they are, which is something that is entirely predictable and not born out of anger and out of emotion, which I think is the way that it's often described. I describe all of this in somewhat in great detail in the book. In the book, I also get into each one of the specific episodes of the war, the most sort of salient moments in the war, the controversial moments of the war, the things that created some tension between Israel and its new Arab allies, between Israel and its most important ally here in the United States. I look at the performance of the Biden administration, how it fared in terms of the politics, the international politics. All of these things are addressed, but the goal really was to be able to be the first out with a book to be able to set the edge in terms of the discussion and the debate that will undoubtedly follow. Up until now, we've seen primarily, individual efforts, op-eds, and perhaps even some longer pieces in places like Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy to try to explain what happened. My feeling was that not enough was done to explain the full context of it. And so that was our goal. That's why we put it out through FDD. It's why we went from ceasefire to bookshelf in 166 days, which may not be a record for publishing, but it certainly was a record for me. I've got to say, I'm certainly feeling it in terms of the exhaustion, but I do feel like it was worth it to do so, to put something out that would be a bit more serious, and just a fuller treatment of a war that was really poorly covered. And again, I think it was not about fake news. It was not about bias. It was about the choices of what was covered, the stories that were covered, and ultimately the angles of those stories that were covered. Very, very different than I think what was reflected in the reality that I saw in the Israeli media, to a lesser extent in the Arab media. But I watched both pretty carefully, more so than I had done before. And the result is this book. It's been out now for a little less than a month. I hope you'll consider a purchase of it. I do think it's a worthy one if you're someone who follows these issues closely. And I think I'll probably end there. I think we're at about 25 minutes now. I thank you again for the opportunity, and Asaf, thank you for your friendship and for being a valued colleague, Suzanne and Alex as well. And I look forward to a conversation about anything that I've talked about here, or any other component of the conflict, any other aspect of the conflict that you all may deem important. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you all around, and the feeling is mutual. A lot of questions I have to myself, but we can always continue with that, offline as well. But let me start off, take the prerogative as the moderator of some of this stuff. First of all, in the space that all of us are in, I mean, as far as the academy and the space that the association deals with, it was fascinating to observe that right after the war in Gaza, there were over 100 of statements that came out about the war in Gaza, all templated by departments and associations in the academy, all with the condemnation of human rights violation, ethnic cleansing. Again, to your point, as far as how this Tom and Jerry fallacy, plays out, and what is being portrayed in the academy. So if you want to, that's one aspect. If you want to tackle that, and obviously how the media impacted, how this affected, how these events really trickled down into the universities and the, at large. The other part, which I think I find very interesting, and I think to your point about the war itself, the mentality, as you and I both know so well, has been by the Israelis, has been to treat Gaza within the framework of the Intifada mentality. And Intifada has been sold as as again the kind of this uprising narrative. It's something that could be minute, it's small, but this is really an ongoing war that we are seeing, that Israel has this ongoing cycle that you described so eloquently. Are you seeing a shift in the Israeli intelligence and the Israeli policymakers to explain it in that way? I mean, I think that part of the problem is that they've used the terminology of Intifada, and they've adopted an Arabic term to describe an ongoing war. But really, it is a war, and it's not being seen as such always, but this is as a conflict, which I think is, has a lot of ramifications on its own. So if you could tackle some of those 2 points, and then I'll open up, and then we can take some questions from the audience.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Asaf. I mean, look, the first thing that I'll just say here is that my assessment is that this Gaza war was an extension of what the Israelis call the war between wars, or the campaign between wars, or in Hebrew they call it the Mabam, Milchama Ben HaMilchamot. The idea here is that there is a constant cat and mouse game that is taking place between Israel and Iran across the Middle East, right? So when Iran is trying to ship precision-guided missiles to Hezbollah, Israel attacks those in Syria, and we see explosions in the middle of the night. When Iran is trying to go nuclear, Israel carries out cyber attacks against some of those nuclear assets, or they assassinate the father of or the godfather of the Iranian nuclear program. The Israelis have purportedly struck assets inside Iraq that were being built up to target Israel. They've struck assets on the high seas, the Gulf of Oman, the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, assets that belong to Iran. I believe that this is an extension of that at this point, that you have to look at the Gaza Strip at this point as another jurisdiction that has been thoroughly penetrated by the Iranians. With Iran, again, I touched on this earlier, Iranian know-how, Iranian training of commandos, Iranian rockets, the tunnels, all of these things are the result of Iranian investments in a proxy force, and Hamas is a proxy force. So I see this much less as kind of that intifada mentality that you referred to, this idea that, it's kind of asymmetric warfare between David and Goliath, and the Palestinians are David and Israel's the Goliath. I would argue that at this point, what goes on inside the Gaza Strip is a direct result of the investments made by the patrons. And I think that the Israelis increasingly understand that. They see the sophistication of the kinds of weaponry and the kinds of tactics that Hamas is using. This is not weapons of the weak any longer. I will say, though, parenthetically, that the most deadly attack that took place, and I do address this, I think it was in the 3rd chapter of my book, that the deadliest attack or the most significant attack that took place during the war that Hamas carried out was actually a weapon of the weak. It was a mortar round that was able to evade Iron Dome and, dumb luck, hit the Ashkelon pipeline and sent fireballs soaring into the air against the night sky. I watched that on, I think it was the 2nd or 3rd night of the war. And it was, I think, now under gag order in Israel. But so there is still that component where, Hamas is just firing whatever it can. But when you look at the aerial drones that Israel destroyed, when you look at the underwater drones that Israel destroyed, when you look at the labyrinth of tunnels that the Israelis now call the Metro, that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make and really required the diversion of a huge amount of assistance that came in. These are organized efforts, and they would not be done without the patrons that we've discussed today. So I think we see less of that intifada mentality. And I think, but that all said, I did hear from Toledano, the head of the Southern Command, a certain amount of sympathy for the people of Gaza, that they are the ones who are still caught in this now, that the fact that Gaza has been exploited by Hamas and by Hamas's patrons is not lost on the Israelis, that they feel actually rather terrible for the 2 million people or so living in this very tiny jurisdiction with really no chance, no prospects for change or improvement. So something to just watch. Now, the other thing that I'll just say, you got into the letters that we saw from the academic world with regard to human rights violations. Let me just say, I got into some of the kind of comparative points that we see, or the commonalities that we see across the wars, the 4 conflicts out of the Gaza Strip in recent years. Let me just say this, that the idea that there were flagrant violations of human rights is, I think, upon further reflection, when you can take a look back and reflect on what the Israelis did, I think it's actually insane to make those allegations. And I'm not saying this as someone who supports Israel, and I will openly say that I do. But I think one needs to take a look at the manner in which Israel carries out these operations. But first of all, these aren't wars that Israel started. The war began with Hamas firing rockets on Israel. So we know who the aggressor was, which then automatically makes Israel's responses a war of defense. So let's just understand this in the broader context of the laws of war. But then take a look at the fact that you've got Hamas firing rockets blindly into Israeli territory. That is the very nature of these wars. They don't have guided weapons yet. So they're hoping to hit something of value, whether it be civilian or military. They cannot aim these rockets. Then we look at the fact that Hamas used these tunnels underneath significant civilian areas, right? We're talking about, tunnels that existed under schools, hospitals. In fact, after the war, and Asaf, you know this better than anybody, after the war, UNRWA came out, the UN Relief and Works Agency came out and actually accused Hamas of having built, and they were able to show the damage that had been done to one of the underground tunnels that snaked under one of their facilities. So we're talking about the use of human shields, which is a war crime. Now, taking a look at the amount of damage that's been done, the Israelis, of course, there is going to be collateral damage, but even the largest structure that Israel destroyed during the war, the Al Jala Tower, which is the famed AP and Al Jazeera building that Israel destroyed during the war, they actually called the owners. The owners vacated those who were on the premises. They actually called every one of the cell phones that was identified inside the tower. Remarkable technology in and of itself. Then dropped the knock-knock bomb on the roof to make sure that everybody knew that a strike was coming. And then after that, gave still several minutes before the strike took place that ultimately destroyed the building. These sorts of things are not war crimes. These are the sorts of things that actually show a reverence for the laws of war. And then just looking at the numbers, of course, every loss of life is tragic, but the idea that there were some 200 people that were killed during this conflict over 11 days with 4,000 rockets fired by Hamas and probably 3 times that fired by Israel against an overwhelming number of legitimate targets. You can't say that Israel was just committing flagrant war crimes. You have to actually, I think you have to see it at this point that Israel took incredible care during the course of this war. Yes, mistakes were made. They happen all the time. That is the nature of war. But again, in light of the fact that this was a defensive war and that Israel spent a huge amount of money and time and effort and care making sure that they were as precise as possible and had as few casualties as possible, it's just, I think it's incredibly irresponsible of our academics to make these sorts of allegations when the facts are as clear as I think they have been.
All right, thank you. A lot more to talk about, but we'll get back to that. So let's go to the audience, and I know there are questions coming in. Suzanne, I'll turn it over to you. Why don't we start with Donna Devine's question, and we'll take it from there.
Absolutely. Okay, so Donna Devine writes, was the bombing of the building that had an AP office the consequence of last-minute or long-term intelligence? And did Israelis convince their U.S. counterparts that their intelligence was accurate and sufficient for bombardment?
So great question. I have an entire chapter dedicated to this in the book. And by the way, Donna, great to have you with us today. Big fan of your work on Twitter, among other places. But look, I'll just say this, that first of all, there's been some debate about how long Israel was aware of the Hamas presence inside the Jala Tower. I can't tell you exactly when the Israelis knew it, but the fact remains is that the Israelis did identify that there was an office there, that it was a Hamas presence inside the tower that was engaging in a signals intelligence operation to jam Iron Dome. Now that in and of itself is significant because Iron Dome, in my view, has probably saved more lives on both the Palestinian and Israeli side than any other measure that could have been taken over recent years. And the reason for that is that, yes, it saves Israeli lives because it knocks out 90 or 95% of the rockets that are fired into Israeli airspace. But I think more importantly, what it does is it provides the Israeli military with the time and space that it needs to make rational decisions, not emotional decisions during the war. In other words, if population centers were getting hit left and right with these Qassam rockets or other rockets that were hurtling into Israeli territory from the Gaza Strip, the IDF would feel compelled to defend its people more vigorously and probably take out more targets that were unapproved in advance, in that target bank that I described, and you'd see far more casualties on the Palestinian side. And so the idea that Iron Dome was under assault during the war, I think absolutely justified the destruction of this building because I think it probably saved more lives and saved more even property than what was destroyed. And obviously that's a counterfactual, but I would stand by that, and I'd love to unpack some of the numbers of what it would what the impact would be if more of those rockets came in, if Iron Dome was somehow down. So then from there, the question is, in terms of the heat that Israel took as a result of this, there was a lot of pressure placed on the United States. Statements that came out from various rights groups excoriating the Israelis for what happened during this particular episode of the war. The Israelis, as I understand it, and it's been reported widely at this point, they brought the intelligence to the White House, and that the Biden White House felt that evidence was sufficient. It doesn't mean that the White House agreed with the decision, but they believe that that the evidence that the Israelis provided was accurate. So there could be a discrepancy between the right of Israel to do it and the decision to do it, as far as the United States was concerned. But the Biden administration generally had Israel's back even after this. The Israelis, by the way, continue to engage with the Associated Press. The Associated Press, by the way, for anyone who's familiar with Mati Friedman's work, this is a journalist and author operating out of Israel. He wrote actually a somewhat famous piece now that appeared in the Atlantic, I don't know, almost a decade ago, I guess, where he talked about how AP deliberately turned a blind eye to Hamas activities that were taking place in and around their facilities in Gaza, that there was a decision not to anger their hosts in the Gaza Strip. Remember, Hamas is a sovereign and it's a brutal terrorist group. So if you're a news agency operating out of Gaza, do you really want to anger those that effectively provide your security? And so this was something that Mati raised. One of his colleagues also raised this as well and verified the episode that Mati had been referring to. And so there are real questions about whether AP was aware of the fact that Hamas possibly had a presence in this building. I don't know if AP has ever fully disavowed this, but it was interesting because even some former Obama administration officials talked about this, and I noted their tweets in the book where they said that, hey, we fully expect that Hamas had a presence in there, but that doesn't mean that Israel should be bombing this building. The last thing that I'll just say about the building is that there was also an office of Al Jazeera in there. And really lost on everyone during this conflict is the fact that Al Jazeera has actually come under fire, legitimate fire from the US military for its alleged involvement in terrorist activity in years past in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. This has been a source of tension, or it was a source of tension between the Bush administration and the government of Qatar, which is of course a sponsor of Hamas, a financial sponsor. There is no question about it. Also, Qatar happens to be a headquarters for Hamas. So the idea that possibly Al Jazeera was aware of this presence is not without precedent. And I don't believe that Al Jazeera has been properly held to account for any of these allegations. And it was really interesting, and I note this at the end of the chapter in my book. Hamas actually gave an award to the Gaza Bureau of Al Jazeera at the end of the conflict, thanking them for their excellent coverage of the Gaza war. So just to get a sense of kind of what's going on here, I'm not making an allegation that the government of Qatar knew exactly what was going on in there, but I would just say that there is a context that went really undocumented by many of the breathless critics of Israel during the war, ignoring the role of Al Jazeera and how it had this uncanny ability to be present near terrorist attacks right before they happen in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and how they somehow continued to get statements from terrorist groups well before they arrived to other press agencies or arrived even in the hands of the US government itself. So I think a lot more to look at if folks are inclined. Who knows if they will.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have a question from Sharwa Khalil, and he asks, one of the things that we have noticed during this conflict is Hamas has effectively used social media to show that Israel is killing civilians and Hamas is an angel. Don't you think that Israel should work on this point to show the reality to the world?
So yeah, look, I mean, I guess I would agree with the general thrust here. I would say that, part of the problem, I'm not a media analyst, so I can't really tell you exactly how this works, but I think there is a general pattern here, and that is that Hamas does not allow for the recording of video inside the Gaza Strip that shows the firing of the rockets, that shows any of the military activity that we can contribute directly to Hamas. And they do this deliberately, and it's sort of in line with kind of what Mati Friedman was arguing in that Atlantic piece some years ago, that Hamas controls their media environment, and then the Israelis have, by all accounts, a free press. They'll show on repeat the destruction of the Jala Tower. They'll show the drone footage of the bombing of the metro system in Gaza. And so all of these things are they feed into this dynamic that I think we that we've just talked about today. In terms of Israel's efforts to explain itself better, they've been abysmal for years. For anybody that's watched, I think they do a fairly poor job of explaining themselves. They call it hasbara, which means explaining. Explaining is effectively losing in these arguments. What I think is was interesting to me, and I'll just offer just a tiny bit of insight in speaking to a senior IDF official during that 10-day visit that I took after the war. I would say, what about this battle for public opinion? Why do you think this is, going so badly, and it went badly again? Not that it's the IDF's job to fix this, it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But what he said to me, I'd never heard before, and that is that Israel, during these times of conflict, is often thinking about trying to deter other actors from getting into the fray, that they're fearful of a two-front or a three-front war. So when they get into a war with Hamas, they're thinking, well, okay, if Hezbollah gets involved, or Shiite militias in Syria or Iran or some other Arab country decides, you know what, I hate Israel too, and I'm going to go start, I'm going to start bombing them as well. So what they are often doing is they're messaging to their enemies, not their potential allies. So they're trying to bare their teeth at those that might do them harm, rather than thinking about how to couch their response to aggression, which I still think that's what this is. But they don't couch it that way. They don't think about, okay, how do I convince people to understand our plight more? They're saying, don't touch us, because I tell you, what we just did to them, we're going to do to you. And I think that may explain some of the disconnect with the messaging frustration that I think you've just articulated.
Terrific answer. Okay, so our next question is from Charles Feynman, and he writes, what should the Bush administration have done differently? What should the Biden administration be doing differently? The renegotiation with Iran seems naive.
So look, the Bush administration, I think, in short, should not have held those elections. I think that was a fateful decision that led to the war, that civil war that split the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, rendering Gaza a lost jurisdiction, as Eliezer Toledano told me during that really interesting interview. That was their big mistake. The idea of trying to promote democracy in the region, I think, is still panned to this day, that it was a misguided effort. I don't think that it's a bad thing. I think it's a question of how much investment you make in such a project. And, are you invading countries to do it? Are you spending untold millions or billions or trillions of dollars to do it? We can argue how much of investment is needed. I think that's still a worthy discussion, especially in light of our decision to get out of Afghanistan and the massive lost investment that we saw there. As far as the Biden administration is concerned, and I actually talk about this toward the end of the book, in looking at how the Biden administration messaged throughout the majority of the conflict and then at the end of the conflict. The majority of the conflict was great, actually, in terms of the Biden administration's response. They were trying to end the conflict. They were working through Egypt to reach a ceasefire. doing everything they could to minimize casualties, but also supporting Israel's right to defend itself against the non-state actor that had clearly started the conflict. And that's what we largely saw out of the Israeli press. I mean, every day, the word that I saw in Hebrew was gibui, which is like to have Israel's back. And Netanyahu talked about it, Gantz talked about it, the IDF talked about it, how Israel was getting this support from Israel, and it was unanimous. And it really, I thought, really resonated with me that, you know, even as they disagreed on issues like the Iran nuclear deal, that the Israelis were able to give that kind of credit to the Biden administration and thank them openly and repeatedly in Hebrew and in English. But then something very strange happened on day 9, and that's when the ceasefire was announced. And I saw it in Arabic first, actually, and then I saw it in the Israeli press. And that's when the messaging out of the White House started to get weird. That's when the Biden administration started talking tough to Israel. And I actually was talking to a handful of journalists during that time, and they were like, well, you know, I just got this strange leak, it was kind of off the record, where, an official said, Biden said he's done kidding around with Bibi and then he needs to end this. What was so strange about it to me was that we already knew the conflict was going to end. There was 48 hours, give or take. That was what was being reported between the ceasefire and what was going to be implemented, right? And these things always have a fuse. But the idea that there was 48 hours, and that's when the Biden administration started talking tough, when they knew that the target banks had been depleted, the cadence of the firing from both sides had dropped significantly, precipitously. So the idea was, okay, like, we're actually seeing the end of the war, guys. Why are you talking tough? And the answer is, I think it was a blank check that Biden could cash so that he could message to the squad, to what is now known as the Hamas caucus. Here we're talking about the sort of hard left of the Democratic Party that has a bee in their bonnet for Israel, that wants to defund Israel, it wants to deprive Israel of Iron Dome and precision-guided munitions, and generally speaking, wants to vilify the Israelis. I saw it as a moment where Biden could talk tough with no ramifications. He had already given Israel what they wanted. Quite frankly, the Israelis didn't even care. It was barely picked up in the Israeli press. It wasn't until actually some of these legislators started advocating for a zeroing out of Iron Dome. That's when the Israelis got upset. But the kind of tough talk from Biden, they're kind of shrugging, saying, thanks, you gave us what we need. All good. Thanks, Mr. President. So I would say that was maybe not a terrific moment for the Biden administration and its performance. The other thing that I would just note here is this, and this is kind of a broader observation. So during this entire conflict, the United States did not give up or turn away from its expressed desire to return to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Now, the JCPOA is, of course, deeply flawed on a lot of different levels, but probably one of the greatest flaws from Israel's perspective, apart from the fact that it doesn't end Iran's nuclear quest, that it merely postpones it. But the other thing is that it gives Iran billions of dollars in sanctions relief that Iran can then turn around and give to its proxies, including Hamas. And of course, Hamas, we know, has over the years has received significant funding, including it's been identified through sanctions announcements that have been handed down by the U.S. Department of the Treasury. So we know that this is the case. We know that Iran provides this assistance financially. So the idea here is that if the United States gets back into the deal, and it is trying to by any means necessary, what we're actually looking at now, and it was a theory back in 2014, which was in between the interim deal and the final deal, between the 2013 interim deal and 2015, when the deal was signed. Back then, it was a theory that Hamas would get some funding from Iran. Now it's a proven fact. And so what we're talking about here is, if a deal is re-entered, the United States will be in the very odd position of funding both sides of the next round, the 5th Gaza conflict. In other words, the United States continues to provide assistance, direct military assistance to Israel. Most of that money is spent here in the United States, but it's still a significant chunk of money We're talking about $3.8 billion to make sure that the Israeli military is prepared for really, and kind of any eventuality. But the United States will also be responsible indirectly and knowingly providing assistance to Iran that trickles down to Hamas. And so this is a strange situation that I would not want to be in if I were sitting in the White House. This, I think, is a liability for states as an arbiter of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and certainly as an actor that's trying to prevent continued conflict in the Middle East.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to toss to Alex Jaffe, who has a question for you, John.
Hi, John. Thanks very much for the presentation, and I look forward to reading the book. I was very much struck by your opening comment that Gaza is an unwanted place, and in a certain historical sense, it's always been that way, at least for the past few hundred years, except as a kind of playground or proxy for other powers. So I want to ask you about one or maybe two of these other powers, namely Turkey, and the situation that seems to be changing rapidly. So, for example, the Crown Prince of the UAE is just had a visit to Turkey, and Erdogan is going to the UAE in February, I believe, and there's a huge new investment agreement between these two countries. Turkey has hosted Hamas for a very long time, provides passports, provides financial and moral support, and so on. What's the game here vis-a-vis Turkey? What is their strategic consideration supporting Hamas on the one hand, and moving away from it or leveraging that support in the broader regional and international sphere?
Great question. Look, the first thing that I'll just say is, and I talk about this in the book, and I can't draw a direct line to the riots that took place in the mixed cities inside Israel, Lod, Akko, et cetera. And there was a lot of that. And by the way, I should just note parenthetically that was probably the only thing that happened during the war where the Israelis openly kind of ceded that they were not prepared for it, that it was probably the largest anomaly, the most important anomaly during the war in terms of the contingencies that the Israelis prepared for. And I think a lot of good work can be done on that. Perhaps some enterprising scholars associated with ASMIA. What struck me as I was watching this, and by the way, also as I'm watching these riots play out on my TV screen, and then also watching these tweets come out from the office of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, where he's really it's almost like he's encouraging this, vitriol and hatred. It made me think for a moment about the multiple reports we've seen over the years about how Turkey is invested in Israel's Arab-Israeli sector. That Erdogan has spent a lot of money investing in various Islamist groups and civil society organizations. And it prompted a question, and I can't answer it in the book, but I noted the existence of it, that there is a significant network of NGOs and civil society groups that are dependent upon Erdogan. And it did make me wonder, did that prompt this in some way? Was there a connection? I don't know. What I can tell you is, in addition to that, Erdogan has been providing a huge amount of assistance to Hamas over the years. It really began after the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap. It's when we began to see it come out into the open. But we even saw before that, if you recall, the flotilla incident of 2010, I believe it was. The IHH was the NGO that was behind that flotilla clash between Islamists and the IDF on the high seas, on the Navy. But the IHH tried to break the blockade and ultimately ended up engaging in what I would call low-level violence against Israel, and then Israel responded with, I think, by all accounts, overwhelming a response. But at any rate, we see Turkish fingerprints on a range of activities designed to promote the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. But more worryingly for me has been the significant presence of Hamas operatives based in Turkey. It's the second largest jurisdiction of a Hamas presence in the world, second only to the Gaza Strip. The leader of the West Bank military operations for Hamas is Saleh Haruri. He was the one who famously planned and financed that triple homicide / kidnapping that sparked the 2014 conflict. If you recall, the third Gaza war. He was recently tied to a bust carried out by the IDF in the West Bank of Hamas cells, which included a number of significant operatives, as well as hundreds of weapons that were caught in a dragnet by the Israelis. So we see a significant investment on the part of Erdogan. The end game, in my view, appears to be what people have widely described as neo-Ottomanism. This idea of trying to promote Turkey as a rising power in the region, maybe not a hegemon, so to speak, but maybe as a competition to the Israelis and probably to the Iranians as well. In fact, there are some people who believe that the Iranians and the Turks are destined to clash at some point because of their competing views about hegemony in the region. I'm not sure I see that. I see actually more cooperation than clashing. But this is Erdogan's goal. And he thinks that the Palestinian issue, and in fact, Palestinian resistance, as he would call it, is the ticket to gaining more adherents and supporters across the region in furtherance of the Islamist cause. Erdogan works closely with the Qataris, and they are very much proponents of the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, don't forget that Hamas is a splinter of the Muslim Brotherhood after all. And so you can begin to see how all this begins to fit together.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, our time is up, John, and I want to be cognizant of everybody's time, but I do want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us. Clearly, as you noted in your cycle, I'm sure that the war in Gaza is not over. We'll be back for the fifth cycle, and probably after that for more cycles to come. But I think that the trends that you identified and the issues that you identified, not to mention the regional actors, are clearly going to be critical points that need to be highlighted and looked at as academics, as policymakers should be looking at, is trying to assessing, where Gaza is next. Even though it's an unwanted area, it's still somebody's problem, and it's going to be our problem, the Israelis' problems. And so those are things that are critical for all of us to keep in mind. So I thank you all around. And of course, I thank everybody this afternoon for joining us. There's a lot of things to think about. And of course, I thank my colleagues, Suzanne, Emily, and Alex for taking the time to join us as well. So any final words, John, before you wrap it up, or we're all good to just buy the book, right?
Buy the book. Great Christmas present, Hanukkah present, Festivus present, you name it. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.